Okay, are we live?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Hennis Schuur. I'm senior advisor here at Kreab, and on behalf of Kreab, the Center for European Reform, and the German Marshall Fund, I welcome you to this webinar, as it's called, Webinar on the Transatlantic Relations. Building Back Better is the title we invented, or not we invented, but we adopted for this. We are living now roughly 3 weeks after the inauguration of President Biden, and it is as if we are living in a new era. We are now, as Europeans, we are no longer an organization invented to harm the US economy, nor are we even worse than China. No, we are, in the words of President Biden, we are allies. And as he said last week at the State Department, allies are the biggest asset of the American foreign policy. But these are words that ring happily in our ears, but let's take a look behind the words and let's see if it's really true that we have turned the page and we are going not only for a re-establishment of the old relations, but are we going for a better relation? Because the United States has changed in the past 4 years, but Europe has also changed in the past 4 years. And are we together turning a leaf and making things better in our transatlantic relations? And to explore that, we have two eminent speakers. Minister Sigrid Kaag, Minister for Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation and leader of the D66 party in the Netherlands, and Anthony Gardner, let's say the last Obama ambassador, US ambassador to the EU. I'm not going to recite their whole CV and history, but looking at it, it struck me, the following thing struck me. They both have studied in Oxford. They both are on record as big fans, supporters of the European idea, the European project, the European Union. Tony Gardner has even written a book about it last year, Stars with Stripes, about what we have done together in the transatlantic relation. And Sigrid Kaag is leader of a party that is well known in the Netherlands for its very pro-European stance, and probably the only true European party left standing in the Netherlands. They both speak six languages, although luckily for us, they have decided to speak to us this afternoon in English. And they both come from countries where we know that they speak the truth. They are open and forthright while speaking with each other. In the Netherlands, we call that as being blunt is a virtue. I think that is an excellent given for a seminar like this. I hope that they both will live up to that reputation. Please be blunt. Please tell us what you think of the future of transatlantic relations. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the moderator for this afternoon, Charles Grant, thanking you once again on behalf of Kreab for your attendance. Thank you. Charles.
Thank you very much, Henna. Good to have these three organizations working together today. Kreab, Center for European Reform, and German Marshall Fund, all working together very well together. I'd like now to turn, without anything more from me, turn to Sigrid Kaag to give her opening remarks before Tony Gardner responds. I think Henna's already introduced Sigrid very well. I would just add that she, as well as being an important Dutch politician, she's played a huge role at the United Nations in very many different UN bodies over the years, including an undersecretary in Lebanon and Syria more recently. And so she's, as well as being a Dutch politician, she's also a great expert on the United Nations and the international system. And I hope in the Q&A we get onto some discussion on multilateralism and whether President Biden is capable of reviving it or not. But that's enough from me. I'll just say on a word of housekeeping rules. This is on the record, this seminar. So people should speak very freely, as Henna said. Everything's going to be on the record. We will tape the event. And without any more from me, over to Sigrid. Sigrid, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, Henna, also for the kind introduction. I mean, you made me laugh because, of course, encouraging a Dutch person to be blunt, the answer will be, what else can we be? It'll be very tough to not be as brutally direct as we can be. But friends, I'm delighted to be here, and it's really imperative to talk. We need to talk because even though it sounds like a cliche, we are at a fundamental crossroads. I very much believe this to be true. And I thank the Center for European Reform, the German Marshall Fund, and Kreab for this opportunity to have a conversation, a heartfelt conversation about our present situation, what we can and need to do to turn things for the better, and how we can actually realistically achieve it. Now, in his famous commencement address at Harvard on June 5th, 1947, George Marshall declared that the world situation is very serious. And while the present world situation might not be as climatic as when Marshall enshrined his plan and name into history, we are at this very crossroads. Global geostrategic tensions are higher than they've been in a very long time. Humanity is facing an existential climate crisis. Societies all over the world, as we look away, are losing freedoms and liberties. And inequality is fueling global mistrust in our own countries, in Europe, but across the globe. And a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in over a century, is exposing and exacerbating all these fragilities and underlying tensions. This is a predicament in which the need for a strong transatlantic relationship is, on the face of it, beyond any question. It's that relationship that directly or indirectly led to the bastions of the 20th century liberal world order. The entire multilateral system is built on it. But this world too is under pressure. Above all, our climate crisis is the biggest social, political, economic, and environmental problem, to put it mildly, facing us right now and many generations to come. It is the problem, because if we fail to address it properly and in time, nothing else can meaningfully be addressed. But next to climate change, I'm talking about a mental and political shift. Francis Fukuyama in 1989 declared in his End of History, liberal democracy as a final form of human government. In short, we won, except of course we did not. Democracy and liberalism were the most successful political ideas of the 20th century, but they are in danger. All over the world, autocrats are trying to stamp out domestic dissent. I mean, what's new? And also are trying to spread their influence. At the same time, many freely elected leaders are increasingly willing to break down the rule of law, the rights of critics and minorities, while implementing their nationalistic and populist agendas. We have them too in Europe. Because of trends like these, Freedom House stated in their 2020 report on freedom in the world that 2019, and it seems like a while back, was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. I dread to read their 2020 edition issued later this year. Free elections, the rights of minorities, freedom of the press, and the rule of law are increasingly under threat worldwide. And this we state in every conference, we state it in UN fora, and yet we fail to turn the tide. And we know that the corona crisis is only further leading to shrinking space to the point there is no space left for civil society, for political dissent, for freedom of speech in many societies. The aforementioned trends have also affected the transatlantic brotherhood or sisterhood. Yes, we are each other's largest trade and investment partner with an annual worth of over €1 trillion in goods and services. Total US investment in the EU is 3 times higher than in all of Asia till now. EU investment in the US is around 8 times the amount of EU investment in India and China together. Together, we still account for 1/3 of the world's trade. But our relationship, that alliance, the pillar of the post-war era is, and it pains me to say, more fragile than we would like to think. The last 4 years have particularly shown that the apparent bond that defined the fiber between Europe and the United States for decades needs constant nurturing, and actually it needs reinvestment. As a European, I was deeply concerned by the actions, many of them by the previous White House administration and its previous incumbent, its previous president. President Trump's rejection of the values underlying many of our values and the multilateral order was, to say the least, remarkable. But his approach was not without precedent, and it was not without support. I applauded sincerely when President Biden declared in his uplifting inaugural address that we have learned that democracy is precious and that democracy is fragile. And it's wonderful to see the US has returned to the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization, and one of the many decisions that President Biden made and his team. It was a breath of fresh air to hear Anthony Blinken say that Europe is a partner of first resort, not last resort, when it comes to contending with the many challenges we face jointly and we need to address collectively. And last Thursday, President Biden told the very State Department that America's alliances, and Hannah spoke to this, are our greatest asset. Can we list the allies and friends of the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China? I find it hard. So I hope that the diplomacy of engagement is indeed back at the center of the bond between the United States and Europe. But a lot needs to be done. And I hope we can end the current trade disputes between ourselves as soon as possible. Because as of now, American import tariffs are still in force. 25% on European aluminum and steel, 25% on wine, cheese, and olive oil. Meanwhile, our unfortunate dispute on Boeing and Airbus is still not resolved. We need to bring this to an end so European companies can compete on equal terms. And the problem should be met like friends and allies do through dialogue and diplomacy instead of the previous tit-for-tat countermeasures which bring us nowhere, which get us nowhere. And we know the multilateral trading system is showing deep erosion with the WTO rulebook critically outdated. And it's up to us to combat distortive trade practices such as asymmetrical market access, subsidies infringing WTO rules, and forced technology transfers. We in the free world should have open markets between us. It's advantageous in and of its own right, but it's also necessary because the world's most successful economy over the past 30 years, and very likely to be the largest for the next 30 years, is China. And as we know, China is growing less liberal, not more liberal. It's state-led, quasi-capitalist, illiberal, and it's attracting admirers all over the globe. While at the same time, massive trade distortion, for example, by that very same China, stifles public trust in trade. But not only. Because of the global dissent, because of global distrust, I proposed with my French counterpart, Franck Riester, a joint US-EU trade forum to coordinate our joint approaches, not only to China, but more globally, and to find ways to further enhance the future of our industries, to be competitive, to be innovative, to be mutually reinforcing. And we must work towards a new green trade deal with the new administration. In the past few weeks, a lot has been said about the investment deal between the European Union and China, which was reached at the very closing of the year 2020. And I'm on the record as saying that the timing was unfortunate, and I still believe this to be the case. Nothing is final until it's ratified, but both the politics and optics on the matter here show that it may not have been the right decision. Looking forward, though, it encourages me to push towards a renewal of the transatlantic button, our alliances, the relationships, even harder. Because that transatlantic relationship, that partnership depends on what happens at home. So I need to start with Europe. How can we build back better? First of all, this is the time for a European Union that is truly strategically autonomous. We talk about it, we find it hard to do, but we need to do this, to achieve it, to accelerate our actions without turning inward and let alone becoming protectionist. We've talked about this for many years, and now is the time to act. The European economy and financial market must continue to be attractive to international investors with a strong European economy. This means economic solidarity when it's necessary, from the north to the south. It means open markets and a level playing field for our companies to remain competitive. Next to this, we need to be able to defend our interests and borders against external threats. For decades, we could shelter behind the protection of the United States, and NATO is and will be the cornerstone of European security. But 21st century security requires a more independent European stance, a capability. An assertive China, an overly assertive Russia, and a host of asymmetric threats from other powers and non-state actors make this an absolute necessity. We must improve the capabilities of European countries within NATO. We must pool more military resources. Over 80% of defense procurement remains national. I suspect this is not the very most effective use of our resources. And of course, this has been said many times in the past couple of years. Everyone agrees on the general direction of travel, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And this is why we find ourselves lacking substantially. It's because we cannot have our cake and eat it too. It's a time of choice, it's a time of change. A fundamental choice in the sharing of sovereignty has to be made. As a party leader of the Democrats 66, hopefully known now across the Atlantic more than before, the choice is clear. We need to relinquish some national sovereignty to Europe to gain more sovereignty with and as Europe. We should not do this only because of our economic and security interests, but because we want to protect and nurture our union of values, because we want to keep the European Union to keep leading the way on human rights, human dignity, and individual liberty. This is also why Brexit was so devastating to us. It's not only bad economics from a European perspective, and I believe from a British perspective, but it also feels as if someone has amputated a member from the family tree of Europe. And we respect the decision made by the British voters because it's a democratic decision. British voters are masters of their own fate. It is their choice, but it remains heartbreaking. But I hope and pray that Brexit will remain an isolated event, an incident, and that the 27 will truly see the benefits of membership of the European Union. But we cannot become or remain complacent. Fair or not, too often the striking advantages of the European Union are simply too dimly apprehended by European citizenry. It's upon us as politicians, as leaders, to make this more clear, to give meaning to values of membership, to give meaning to what it means to be a European citizen, to be part of the European Union. Europe needs to work for its citizens, to protect lives and livelihoods, to make good on our promises of opportunity, to provide a true European Green Deal which works and which is also good innovative economics, economics of the future, to invest in a digital Europe while protecting individuals against the enormity of tech giants. And when it comes to the situation in the US, for my American friends, you'll understand I am more reluctant to make further suggestions. But as with Europe, the role of the United States in the world depends also what happens at home. And we know Mr. Trump, while he's gone, Trumpism is not. And President Biden has a Herculean task laid out ahead of him. And I'd like to encourage him from this humble and modest place I'm in to find solutions in cooperation, in strategic partnership with his true allies, and to truly avoid, as he has done already, the unilateralism of his predecessor. The executive order, in effect, to buy American might not be the level playing field we should be looking for. We can create together and buy from one another. And let me also say, I hope our Republican friends will rise to the challenge so a true effort of healing and unity can be undertaken. I'll be closing off. We are, I submit to you from the outset, at a crossroads. And if we build back better at home, we can build back better globally, multilaterally, based on standards, based on shared values. And if we lead in this way, we can foster democracy, not only strengthen our own democracies, but also share democratic values. We can strengthen liberal principles. This should start with the Transatlantic Alliance, because when the transatlantic partnership is strong, the European Union and the US, United States are strong. It means a new agenda for global cooperation. It means the provision of a solid base for stronger multilateral action and institutions, despite the challenges, because of the challenges. And this means 2 Green New Deals to save the planet. This means a new green trade agenda between ourselves. And it means, as President Biden has proposed, a global summit for democracy, because we're very much in need of it. And I believe this partnership is necessary, not only to meet the challenges of this century, but it's also the only credible path forward. It's upon us to deliver. So I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Minister, for covering so much ground. And let's hope that your optimistic vision for the future can be fulfilled without question. I turn now to Tony Gardner.
Moral duty.
Moral duty, absolutely, absolutely. And if only every party in Europe thought like the D66, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. But that's for another day. I turn now to Tony. Tony Gardner, you're not just the former ambassador of the US to the European Union. You're also a very active member of the CER's advisory board. And as Henna said, you've also written a very good book on the US-EU relationship, which I would strongly recommend. Tony, do you agree with everything Sigrid said? I hope not. It would be rather a boring seminar, but tell us what you think of it and hopefully find something to disagree with. Over to you, Tony.
Well, Charles, I hate to disappoint you because I agree with every single word, and it's a very rare thing for me to agree with everything the minister has said. I think it's just terrific, and I think it is our moral duty. I'll try to be brief. First, I wanted to say the role of the Netherlands has never been more important, especially now that the UK regrettably has left. And I say more important than ever before to promote key transatlantic priorities, from climate change, the minister mentioned several times, to trade, digital economy, reforming the WTO, promoting human rights, dealing with China and so forth. You know, in the old days when the UK was a member, our life was easy in the United States because the UK was our megaphone to some extent within the EU, and now they've left. The Netherlands is going to play an absolutely critical role. Look, I wanted to say just a few things. I've been involved in the Biden campaign from day one, and I know the president. I'm speaking obviously as a private citizen now, but you know, the sense of urgency is clearly shared. And in the work that we were doing, in my working group that I was running on the EU and on trade and on Western Europe, there was a sense of urgency, meaning what can we do in foreign policy when a lot of the bandwidth will be taken up by very urgent domestic, critical priorities, from dealing with the pandemic and dealing with racial inequality and so forth. And of the available bandwidth for foreign policy, what can we achieve, not even in 4 years, but in 2 years before the next midterms, right? Yeah. And it really means changing the way we look at a lot of things. And the papers we wrote were really focused on where can we make progress in non-controversial areas. We don't have the luxury of launching more TTIPs, for example, and debating with each other and not signing agreements and not getting things done. We need to stop what I call the bureaucratic blob of talking about everything, making high-sounding statements and not getting enough concrete things done. We have a lot of challenges. The minister mentioned many of them, but let's start with autocrats gaining the upper hand. I think this is indeed a real issue for us. And it's not just a few of our member states. We just had 4 years of a president that really called into question some of our own basic principles. And Europe has its own trumps. That's the point I want to make. We didn't invent demagogic populism. Let us in the United States be a morality tale for you and around the world. Europe is indeed a partner of first resort. I really believe it with every bone in my body, and that's why I wrote my book. And I think it's still the case. And yes, I think there is a broad and a deep agenda. And the minister again mentioned many things where I think it's not overly optimistic to say that we can make some significant progress. Not only clearing up the wreckage of the past, such as the tariffs on aluminum steel that were mentioned that should never have been imposed. I mean, claiming that imports from allies at a time of peace is somehow a threat to national security is, of course, absurd. I think the time has come to really address now the Boeing-Airbus dispute. There are some good ideas that are being exchanged. We should lift the car import tariffs threat. The WTO rules need updating. We certainly should be engaging with the EU on that. That's a longer term agenda, but it's not overly optimistic to suggest that we can agree on a lot of the ideas in the EU white paper, and not overly optimistic to think that we can really exert leverage on China, particularly to address its abusive trade and investment practices. And I think the US Trade and Technology Council that was mentioned is also a very important idea that we shared also in the work that we were doing. We have some ideas about what to do. And again, here we need focus, focus, focus. We can't afford the blob again. We have to work together to defend our elections from malign foreign and also domestic threats. We need to retool our competition tools and think more broadly in terms of new tools that we should put into place to ensure that we have truly innovative markets. We need to combat, fake bots and deep fakes that make the nature of our public debate more problematic. I think we've seen the impact of that. The new Green Deal is absolutely essential. And here, both of us can work on many things, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and make sure this WTO compliant. If I had to mention one area, it really has to be, it's got to be, what do we do together on China and trade coupled? And I can tell you, just as a reality check here, that our voters and our congressmen and women will ask the question, what are allies good for if they're not good for the critical issue that we have together, and that is China across the board, not only on trade, on security issues. But if allies can't work with the United States on this issue, then we have a problem. And in 4 years, we could well be faced with another round of demagogic populism in the United States. Now, I personally believe the China investment deal is not as problematic as some have said. So here, maybe, surprisingly, perhaps I'll be a bit different. True, for absolutely sure, the timing was unfortunate, definitely unfortunate. The appearances are important, sometimes just as important as the substance. It is true that if the EU had asked the United States to put its pen down when negotiating a deal with China, probably we would have said absolutely no, we will move ahead. Also true that the EU deal got many of the things that the US has already banked. However, I agree with the minister, it could have been handled differently, but let's move on. I think we don't have any time to waste. On the issue, and here I'll quickly wrap up, on strategic autonomy, I should say that this administration is about as Euro-sympathetic, friendly as one could imagine, frankly. And I've seen quite a few. I worked in the Clinton White House and I worked in the Obama years. This is a very pro-European team, from Tony Blinken across the board, Jake Sullivan. However, the reason I say this is that there's a lot of sympathy for the idea that Europe should be more capable. That's the term I really prefer, because I don't really understand what strategic autonomy means, frankly. The French have one definition for it, and there seem to be a lot of other definitions. If it means equidistance, I think it's a mistake. If it means a Europe that is truly independent and is capable militarily of acting on its own in many circumstances, I'm rather doubtful. But if it means a Europe that's more capable, absolutely. More pooling, more efficiency, absolutely, as long as it's not duplicative or undermining of NATO. So I don't think there's an issue here. But what I wouldn't want to see is Europe spending a lot of energy, chasing moonbeams, to put it that way. It has to be realistic. It has to walk before it runs, right? I think that, given the urgency that the minister was so powerfully articulated, we really need to identify the key areas, and we mentioned some of them: climate, trade, digital economy, where we can make action at speed. And I mentioned speed because the EU has these pooled sovereignty in areas, and those are some of them, where instead of dealing with member states on every occasion, we can deal with a smaller set of actors and really try to make progress. So my conclusion is, I wish I could sit down and with the minister. Of course, I'm a private citizen, but it sounds like there's a lot to do. I'm relatively optimistic that despite the domestic challenges the US faces, we can make progress, but we have to be super disciplined in the areas we choose. With that, I guess I should close. Thank you.
Yeah. That's good.
Thank you very much, Tony. I like that phrase, chasing moonbeams, as how not to do strategic autonomy. I hope there's somebody in the audience who's French who can chip in with his own or her own thoughts on strategic autonomy, and whether or not it's just chasing moonbeams. We've got a lot of people in this event. We have roughly 150 people taking part, which is great. Not time to give everybody a word on the floor, but we can certainly fit in many people over the next 45 minutes or so. I'm turned first to, before I turn to Marco Keim from Egon as the first questionnaire, the first comment. Let me just say there's two ways to ask a question. Either you can say something in the chat function, or you can raise your hand. Either is fine with me, but firstly I turn to Marco. If my colleagues can unmute Marco, that'd be great, thank you. Do we have Marco Keim?
I'm not sure whether I'm unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you, Marco. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Yeah, sorry, I'm Marco Keim, management member of Aegon, an insurance pension asset management company operating in 20 markets, but our biggest markets are the US and the Netherlands. Actually, in the US, we are better known under the brand Transamerica. And my question actually to both of you is the following. We're all very happy with the new Biden administration. We focus a lot on the US over the last couple of years. But what about Europe? Because also there, you have the Brexit. You could imagine a potential further dividing of Europe. If you look at the economic differences between the North and the South, if you look at diverging views between the West and the East on judicial systems and freedom of speech. So in that context, and again, a question to both of you, how can Europe be a strong partner for the US? What should we do? And how can we improve our impact? Because again, if there's a divided Europe, who are we talking to if I would be looking at this from a US context? So actually a question to both Minister Kaag and Mr. Gardner, what your views are what Europe should do to be impactful.
First the Minister could answer that, then I'll turn to Tony.
Okay,
Minister.
well, thank you very much, Marco. Of course, you hit the nail on the head. We have a lot of issues, let's put it this way, domestically within the Union. As you said, we have illiberal democracies, we have populist leaders. Tony mentioned our own little Trumps here and there. We have some politicians in every country. We all have them, and they sort of stifle dialogue, and it has rendered many a European issue from a European Union perspective actually either toxic or it is channeled through sort of irreputable information, I would say. Sort of it's fake news from, whatever channel you name it, the label European Union, it's negative, it's bad, it's considered to be a loss of sovereignty. So we have our work cut out for ourselves. I believe the new European Commission, von der Leyen, of course, our very own Frans Timmermans, they're doing a fantastic job on the leadership issue and the strategic agenda. But member states also need to be helpful and willing to support that agenda and to give way, to let go of parts of the sovereignty, to support the Commission in the agenda and in the implementation. Take, for example, the Green Deal. We all have to make choices. We need to adjust. Similar on the strategic autonomy when it comes to the economy. Which sectors do we want to build up? Do we want to have big champions, industrial champions, sort of be reborn in this regard? So I think we need to do our homework. As you know, Marco, if I speak for the Netherlands, and Henne said it, we are the only party in the Netherlands left that is truly pro-European, unashamedly, and proud of it. But we have a strategic agenda for Europe. In our parliament, most votes are sort of turn out to be a narrowing down and a lowering of the standards or expectations of what we are willing to do as a country towards Europe. Even though we are a net beneficiary, we depend on Europe for our security. We depend on, not next to NATO, of course, we depend on Europe for our stability. Our biggest trading market is within the European Union, yet that message is not heard. So a stronger, more unified Europe is extremely important. And I truly hope, as I mentioned before, that most other countries may have been dreaming of their very nexit or exit or whichever letter of the country comes before it. But I hope they've seen the reality of what it means to be on your own in a global world where competition is tough and the threats are even bigger We have no choice. Europe is not only, to me, a moral imperative, it's a smart choice, and we need to make it work.
Tony.
I would, yes, thanks. I'll be brief here. I think there are a couple of very concrete ways. One is co-sponsoring the climate talks with the United States, human rights for sure, but I really want to focus on one thing because I think it's the core issue. China trade. I mention that because many millions of Americans and many legislators, both on the Republican and even on the Democratic side, think that the Trump way of doing business bilaterally and transactionally, in which the US was acting like a bull in a china shop, forgive the pun, was okay, that it's a better way of getting results. That's fundamentally wrong. We need to defeat that idea soundly. And the way we do that is to show that working with allies, working within the rules, working with the multilateral institutions is a better way of getting things done, particularly on China and on trade. What do I mean by that? It means changing the WTO rules, working together on foreign direct investment, which is already happening, tightening the rules, making it more difficult for the Chinese and some others to be acquiring sensitive technologies in our economies, addressing Chinese over-subsidization, overproduction, enforcing our trade rules, which is happening now. There's a trade enforcement office of the EU, and now our focus in the US will be on enforcing our trade rules, shutting our markets to the Chinese if they refuse to do what I said, is to reform those rules and to abide by them. And there are a lot of other areas we can work not only bilaterally, but with Japan and our key allies in putting pressure on China. Now here I have to say I'm a little bit concerned because the initial signs are that the Chinese are very astute in finding ways of splitting Europe, one country from another, of sprinkling dollars of investments to gain advantage, and so, diluting the EU's common approach on human rights or on South China Sea and man-made islands and many other areas, and on trade. So we need to be careful. That's my key point, is the partnership really has to be on trade and on China. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree.
Let me follow up Tony's comment on China with one of my own before I bring in other people to join the conversation. There's a question for both Tony and the Minister on China and the EU. Let me put a thesis on the table. I think it's going to be very hard to get the EU and the Americans working together well, despite goodwill on both sides, because of two reasons. One is interest, one is attitude. On interest, Europe simply depends more it spends more on trade with China than the US does in terms of economic interest, which is why the Germans and others, including the Dutch, are very, very keen to maintain their economic relations with China. And they want to, in a sense, have their cake and eat it. They want to be critical of China on human rights when necessary, but not damage those investment agreements and those trade agreements that are very important to the European economy, particularly the German economy. While the Americans have a much more strategic approach, they care about security in East Asia, which frankly very few Europeans do. The British and the French perhaps a little bit, but most Europeans don't care hugely about East Asian security and not going to send ships to the South China Sea if the Americans have some maneuver going on there to help the Americans. So that's interest. And the other difference is attitude. And as far as I can see, the main European complaint about China is one of Chinese behavior or so-called misbehavior, i.e. on human rights. We don't like what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang or Hong Kong. On the behavior of Chinese businesses, we don't like state subsidies giving Chinese businesses an unfair advantage when they buy European companies. We don't like the theft of intellectual property. But I think if China behaved better, most European governments are fairly relaxed about China being very big and strong and powerful. Now, in America, is it not the case that it's not just Chinese behavior that is a source of concern, though it is, it's rather Chinese power per se, the fact that China is rivaling and challenging and perhaps equaling American power in Asia. And that in itself is a problem. And across the House divide in America, Republicans, both Democrats, see Chinese power as a threat, as a potential threat, certainly as a challenge. Therefore, the Americans are always going to be rather tougher towards the Chinese than are the Europeans, even if they may wish to work together. So my slightly gloomy thesis I leave on the table for comment is that it's going to be very, very hard to get the two sides working together. But perhaps I exaggerate the difficulties. Sigrid, why don't you, do you agree?
Well, I think it's a healthy diagnosis and a fair one. I would agree with you that we are in a greater sense of dependency. Hence, we're more vulnerable. We've seen this not only recently in the corona crisis, but so the entire value chain was broken down. So I think the awareness around dependency will drive political decisions. I also agree with you that whilst we talk a good talk on human rights, due diligence, we're not always capable of delivering or imposing it, far from it. Not only China, the sort of the elephant in the room, but in many other country situations too. So in the Netherlands, we always call this the tension between the preacher and the merchant. And we always delicately try to pretend or act as if the two can go together, but we are not in a position as a European Union yet, I think, to make these very tough choices. You've seen this, if I look back at the Belt and Road Initiative. 17 European member states, if I recall, signed off on the Belt and Road Initiative. We held off. But in the meantime, all investments by Chinese investors, state-led companies, had already taken place. So I think it's a fair game. However, I'm a little bit more optimistic when it comes to political will and intent. Yet the viewpoint from the States is different. I think the competition for power, being the #1 economy or #2, is a very real one. We are not in that position. We don't aspire to be. We are sort of the triangulating partner around values and commitment to democracy. But I believe if we have the same shared intent in terms of the strategic direction of travel by Chinese predominance globally, with all that entails geopolitically, we should overcome our hesitations and our lesser priorities. So we can team up more. And that's a point of political will and leadership to make those choices. But I agree with you. It's German automotive industry, French interest, Dutch companies, investors, traders that will speak out and of course also influence political decisions at the end because they vote. And political parties will not be deaf to the cries out there. So that's the reality check we have. But political will is a good force for good.
I'm glad you're slightly more optimistic than me. Tony, how does it look to you?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said, Charles, and there are going to be disagreements for sure, and for the reasons you noted, because the US being a military security power in Asia is going to look at this differently. But I still think there's a lot that can be done. And I have the sense of urgency that the window is now closing. Now, I also think, Charles, that the EU, and I've seen this throughout my career, even when I was in Brussels, the EU underestimates its power repeatedly, dramatically. It is a regulatory superpower, and it is a trade superpower. The power that the EU has, given its single market, is something it's typically been underestimated. And the Chinese listen, certainly to the EU when it talks trade and when it talks regulations. And we've been Boy Scouts, Charles. We've been Boy Scouts, both of us, for years, in terms of letting the Chinese dominate world standard-setting bodies. It didn't need to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. We need to understand the issue, the threat, prevent the Chinese from dominating those institutions, which are critical because they enshrine advantages for Chinese exporters and set values in everything like facial recognition and video surveillance and so forth, and artificial intelligence. It doesn't have to be that way. If we work together and we have our researchers work together and have joint programs in critical areas and write rules in some of those areas, including artificial intelligence, noted, by the way, in the EU white paper, we can actually have a lot of influence. If we close off our markets in some areas, the Chinese will listen. And that's, this is not pie in the sky, I think, overly optimistic stuff. I'm just saying the time for being Boy Scouts is over. And even if we disagree in many areas, that's okay. Let's focus on the areas where we can agree. And by the way, I'll just end, on supply chains, a lot of work we can do in identifying where together we are over-reliant on Chinese inputs, not just in medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, but in rare earths and key raw materials. That's not overly optimistic to think that we together can do work to reduce our reliance. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks to both of you. I've got questions coming on the chat function, the raise hand function, and the Q&A function. So I'm going to try and speak and try and pick and choose a few. Firstly, I turn on the raised hand function to Korteweg from the Klingendahl Institute, my former colleague. Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. My name is Korteweg. I'm formerly with the Center for European Reform and currently at the Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands. It's Fantastic to listen in on this conversation. I have a question to both speakers. To Ambassador Gardner, following up to Charles's comments just now, Europe may indeed be the partner of first resort, which is great, but that doesn't mean it's the partner of only resort. The question is, how patient will the Biden administration, and particularly Kurt Campbell, be, in your view, about with a Europe that is indeed chasing moonbeams, about China policy, but also about its own strategic autonomy, before the US focuses on other partners in Asia instead to work primarily on China? My question to Minister Kaag, I wanted to ask a question about digital services tax, but I want to ask you about Russia. We've just had a pretty heartrending press conference between HRVP Josep Borrell and Foreign Minister Lavrov. And the current Dutch government maintains that Nord Stream 2 is a purely commercial project. Now, some in the United States tend to disagree. And increasingly in Europe, there are also voices saying we need to take a different position on Nord Stream 2. Now, in a month's time, you might be the next prime minister. If you are the next prime minister of the Netherlands, what position will you take on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project? Thank you.
Charles, you want me to?
Yeah, why don't Tony, you go first, then the minister. Yeah.
I'll be very, very brief, because I think not much patience is my bet, because we have to deliver. So if it turns out that we just don't agree on our approach to China, I think that the focus, I'm guessing, is we'll shift to others: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and others who feel the full brunt of China's increasing movement toward autocracy and one party and one person rule. Australia certainly is front line. So my guess is, there'll be limited patience. Thanks.
Minister.
Yeah, Rem, no, thank you very much. Always the home crowd is the tough crowd. If we win the elections, what would our first decision be on Nord Stream 2, just to cut to the chase? I think the time we're at the end of the chapter where we can collectively say that this is purely a commercial project. And I have a lot of sympathy for our American audience that have always questioned that premise. Yes, it's commercial, and we need to be mindful not to politicize commercial endeavors, but of course, security of supplies, particularly energy supplies, are by nature related to security, the safety of the supply line. So I can't give you a yay or a nay, but I think it's very important we take stock of everything that surrounds Nord Stream 2 in light of current realities and Russian posture, as well as clearly the inability to dialogue with the European Union in the way it ought to on very sensitive issues.
Thank you. Now, when people put in questions on the chat function, could they perhaps help by saying if they want to ask them themselves or want me to read them out? For example, I'm turning now to Lars Alexander Mucha as a question on Turkey-EU relations. Would you like to put it yourself, Lars Alexander, or ask me to read it out? Or perhaps we can unmute you so you can put the question yourself. It's quite a short question anyway. No, in that case, I'll read it out. How is the new Biden administration going to reconcile the deepening divide between Brussels and Ankara with its own policy strategy vis-a-vis the EU and NATO? So clearly a question on Turkey there, which I think both our speakers, I'm sure, will have something to say. Maybe for a change, Sigrid could go first, then Tony.
The question was how the US president was going to sort of align or reconcile.
Basically, for both the EU and for America, what can we do about Turkey's drifting? I put words into Lars Alexander's mouth. Turkey's drifting off to the east. It's drifting away from America, away from NATO, away from Europe. What, if anything, can we do about it?
Well, I think that's a tough one. It's been a long time coming. We've seen this over recent years, not only, for instance, in the Syria crisis. We've seen it recently in the Mediterranean. There are either policy choices or incidents which demonstrate a very assertive Turkey and a Turkey that clearly is clashing with a number of the core values that we hold to. The approach so far, and I think will remain, of the European Union is one of dialogue where we can, but very clear messages where this is needed. I think this is also a moment where the European Union and the American presidency need to discuss how we want to team up and where joint messages could be conveyed and if there are any decisions taken. Turkey remains an important NATO ally, but there's a great dissonance on many serious issues, from human rights to its posture in the Middle East and its engagement in the Syria crisis.
Okay, Tony?
I really have almost nothing to add. The minister, I think, has said it all beautifully, but I would just say, look, the NATO allies need to be democracies. And when they cease being democracies because the freedom of the margin of maneuver of the media and judiciary are almost, disappearing, it's a real problem. When NATO allies start buying military equipment from our enemies, it's a real problem. I've really no solutions to offer here, but I agree the dialogue needs to remain open in areas where we can cooperate. But I have no solutions to offer. Thanks.
Okay. I have a question back to China from Leven Taylor. Forgive me for pronouncing your name wrong if I've done that. Probably I have. Would you like to ask it yourself? Can we unmute Leven Taylor? Okay, in that case, I'll read it out if I can. Following our discussion on China, might the Chinese authority and leadership offer the best ammunition to help Europe and the US align in policy towards China? Yes, okay. So basically, it's the worse China behaves, the easier it might make it for the Europeans and Americans to work together. We've sort of answered that already, but any further comments on that, Tony or Sigrid? Not really.
No, I don't think so. I mean, one reflection. In theory, that's the case in any world situation, but particularly, of course, when one talks geopolitics and strategic outlook. However, the convergence of interests from trade to geolocation is so significant with China that it's not an easy path to follow. There's no clear-cut yay or nay, even though there ought to be. If China was not China, then of course, the voice and the courage that one finds politically is often greater. But we need to get real here. The interest, the presence of China all over the world, and its reach is such that one needs to, when one makes a decision and calls a situation out, you need to be sure to follow through. If you don't, it becomes meaningless and very hollow.
Right, okay. And we've already had a question on Nord Stream. We have another question on Nord Stream. I know that, Tony, you didn't answer the question on Nord Stream, did you, yourself? It was more the minister who answered it before. So let me put this one to you. Don't you think that Europe needs Nord Stream to enhance its energy security until it's built up enough renewable energy capacity? That's from Heinrich Kreft.
No.
Okay, good answer.
Look, this administration, I believe, shares this skepticism about this particular project. However, I think the tactics are going to be very different. I mean, the tactics of the former, regime were pretty extraordinary, and some of it was from our legislators who sent letters that were threatening consequences to companies and private individuals, and some of it came from the administration itself. So we're not going to be bullying and harassing, because that's not the way one deals with allies. The project is certainly as political as it is economic, in my personal view. It may be now too late to stop. The only thing I'll say here, Charles, I think the issue is much broader than just a pipeline. The issue is energy diversification, what we do with Europe to ensure that it is as diversified as possible through sources and routes of supply. And there we made a lot of progress, right? On LNG terminals and on new pipelines, bringing non-Russian sources of gas, for example, and also of oil. That's where we should focus our interests. And the 3 Cs initiative is very important. We pledged $1 billion under Trump. Let's go ahead and do it. Let's work together on new projects.
Okay, thank you. Got some more questions coming in now. Question from Margot Dorr. Can we elaborate a bit on what Mrs. Kaag said about Buy American? We know President Biden signed an executive order strengthening the Buy American provisions, but how does this add up with US-EU trade cooperation, multilateralism, and free and open markets? I guess Tony ought to say a word about that as well, but it's firstly, the Minister, then Tony.
Well, you know, of course, we've seen under President Trump a remarkable resurgence of protectionist policy decisions and measures. Of course, as Europeans, we projected all our hope on President Biden, as we did on President Obama. And sometimes I think we might beguile ourselves a little bit, i.e. President Biden also has a duty and a need to bolster American consumer patterns, whereas they buy American. So ironically, this wasn't a totally novel decision by Trump. He just exaggerated and he went all the way against shared interests and against sort of any rule book in terms of international trade agreements. I mean, the steel and aluminium was one of the most flagrant decisions, and Tony mentioned that as well. So we understand buy American. We also like the Netherlands consumers to buy Dutch where they can. However, you do not want to have a world trade situation deteriorate again, particularly in times of crisis such as this pandemic, where everybody closes off borders. Some people start to believe autarky is the way out. Yes, buy local where you can, buy your national products, but without the protectionist measures that sometimes are then put into place to enforce that behavior. I mean, that's the difference. And of course, there is greater value in competition, in open markets, but that are rules-based, and where we look to quality and protection of consumers when it comes to phytosanitary standards and safety standards. But that's an entirely different remit from only the message on buy only your national product. And here the world isn't like this anymore. And I think most consumers also forget how the different articles that they buy, how they're sourced, where they're sourced from, and how they're ultimately put together and produced.
Tony.
Yeah, I think the minister put it beautifully. I agree. You know, I was at the sharp end of this topic during TTIP, where we were, let's say, beaten up by our European friends about public procurement, about the Jones Act, maritime services. And what can I say? Even under the Obama years, there was very little margin of maneuver in Congress. If anything, the movement was to be more restrictive rather than to be more open. That's the domestic reality. You know, as much as it pains me, frankly, to say it, because I think it has implications for the efficiency of our economy. That's the domestic reality. And it's an example of what I said earlier, where we need to identify areas where, you know, for domestic reasons, we just can't make progress. Let's just park it and not beat ourselves, because, and just accept the reality of the situation. Thanks.
Okay, question from Adam Isaacs for both panelists. How long will it take for UK-EU relations to settle down, and how much damage will be done in the meantime? What advice would Tony give if he was still US ambassador in Brussels to the EU on how it should cope with how the Biden administration should provide couples counseling in the coming months?
I missed the first part, Charles. I'm sorry.
It's difficult to me to read in the chat function, Tony. I'm just getting back to the beginning of the question. I can't read it all at once. How long will it take for the UK-EU relations to settle down?
Oh.
How much damage will be done in the meantime? And then the second question is, if you were still US ambassador, what would you advise the Biden administration to do?
Oh, well, super briefly, I'll say this. You know, I was involved in the analysis of Brexit from the US perspective, Europe, and even the UK, and I think our conclusions are well known, but that's history. That's the point. It's history. Let's move on. The difference here is that I think this administration will see the triangle of relationship, US, UK, UK-EU, and EU-US, as we're having to work together, i.e. it's not just one of the three sides of the triangle that matters, US-UK. That was the Trump view. It's not the view. I'm actually rather optimistic, at least in the sense that there's a lot that we can do with the UK. Post-Brexit, on climate, on human rights, on WTO reforms, on sanctions, good governance, and so forth. There's a lot that we can do. So even though, in my view, the UK has lost influence on the world stage, and we regret the decision. It was a sovereign decision of a democratic government. We need to accept it and move on.
Okay, Ingrid?
Yes, no, I agree. I think we as well, we need to accept it and move on and get over our old hurt. I mean, we have to accept as well that from my perspective, and like Tony, I lived in the UK for a number of years, and I've always felt as a European that the United Kingdom always felt that we had joined them. They were never fully sort of in their behavior and their emotions a member. And now they've gotten back their sovereignty the way they want it, you know, move on, live with it, deal with it as well. But there's so many areas where we align, where we need each other. And from a European perspective, alongside France, the UK is the only permanent member of the Security Council. It's a credible military force. We need their role in Europe in terms of security, the intelligence services, the area of justice. And there are many areas where we are completely dependent or certainly grateful for the extent of the cooperation that we want to build on. It just takes a little bit of time to field that new relationship, but we cannot be hostage to the past.
Okay. Another question from Heinrich Kreft. Should the US and the EU not lead together a global effort for vaccination? Does anyone like to pick up that one?
Well, I think from a Netherlands perspective, a little bit of modesty is in place at present, because we haven't done so well with our own national vaccination campaign. So I'm saying this with the highest extent of modesty and humility. But it would be very good if the European Union, and certainly teaming up with the US, could invest more in production facilities to accelerate and scale up the availability of vaccines, but also with an international outlook. Because the weakest link in the chain is still the most forgotten link of the chain, and that is most developing countries. And we need to be as mindful of the needs elsewhere from a human perspective, but also from a shared stability and prosperity perspective. So much more is needed in investment and access to the vaccine. And it also means financing.
Just quickly, you know, a while ago, I did a bit of archaeological digging. And I found that in 1995, the US and the EU signed the new Transatlantic Agenda, a long document, and part of it referred to preparedness for future pandemics. And very little was done. I mean, we did work on Ebola, of course, but very little was done. It's time now to actually prepare for future pandemics, and from so many perspectives. And you mentioned a few of them. It's joint research. It's eliminating tariffs on pharmaceuticals or protective equipment. It means preparing for corridors for travel through digital health passes. It means stockpiling. It's so many aspects to this problem, and it's a bit disappointing we haven't done more together, but we certainly should. Yeah,
I agree.
The question from Mihailo Jovetic on the JCPOA, the EU's, the EU, US, China, Russia, Iran nuclear deal. To what extent and how quickly do you see the US foreign policy aligning with the EU interests under Biden, particularly regarding Iran and the JCPOA? With the Biden administration stating it will not lift extraterritorial sanctions. Any thoughts on that? Perhaps Tony first on that one.
Well, an effort will be made to save that agreement. You can imagine the domestic, the difficulties which led to, well, not only domestic difficulties, but the reality that lifting sanctions and lifting pressure on Iran now is not seen as the correct approach. But at the same time, there's no doubt that the agreement will have to be looked at again in a new light, both in terms of its breadth, scope, and what it covers, and also how long it's going to be in place for. So I'm rather doubtful that the agreement as it is going to now be okay. We can just go on as if nothing happened. So it'll probably have to cover some of the Iranian activities abroad. It might have to cover ballistic missiles. It'll have, and we need Europe to help bring Iran to the table to believe that there is a quid pro quo, which was at the center of the deal. That Iran will benefit from going back into compliance, which it is no longer been.
Right. There's been a question a long time ago set by Stefano Stefanini. Would you like to ask it yourself, Stefano? Because I can't actually see it all at the same time. It's a little bit difficult for me to read it out for technical reasons. If you'd like to unmute yourself, then you can put it to everybody listening. If not, I can read it out in two halves. But
I think I've unmuted myself.
Thank you. Yes, we can hear you.
Hello, everyone. I'll make it shorter. This is addressed especially to Ambassador Gardner. Okay, rebuilding transatlantic relations. There are many components of it, many formats. Where would you start? You have the NATO, of course. You have the EU-US relationship that you're very familiar with, and you have special formats like the E3, which works on the JCPOA. Since you mentioned China and trade as the center of the rebuilding, the relationship with you should be the starting point, since it's the EU that can deliver most on in both areas. What do you think?
Ciao Stefano. Hello. Yes. So I guess in a few sentences, we have to prove the relevance of this transatlantic relationship. And by that, it means jobs. What does it mean for jobs? What does it mean for economic growth? More so, and what does it mean for saving the planet? Okay, so it's not just jobs. What does it mean for making sure we have a habitable planet to live on? But for me, it's jobs, it's trade, and it's China. And indeed, the EU is the relevant actor. But as you, Stefano, obviously very, very well know, it means also working with the key member states. And it's not just Berlin. Everyone seems to assume that the United States will just reach out to Berlin. It means reaching out to relevant member states. And the Netherlands, is absolutely central because it shares a lot of our interests. Member states that have influence and clout at the EU and on issues that matter, and certainly on trade, it will be important. I mean, look, Jake Sullivan has repeatedly said a foreign policy that it works for the middle class, right? That's the tagline. And I think it's more than just a phrase. I think it's reality. We all have to prove to our voters that what we do as diplomats or legislators, whatever, it means something for people's livelihoods. And that means making the world trading system fairer and work better. And it means trade adjustment assistance as well. I would like to see the US and the EU work together to say, how can we buffer the impact of globalization for people who lose out? And we haven't spoken enough about people who lose out, because there are those. And we both have failed, and we need to make a better job.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to prioritize, we've got time for another few questions before we wrap up. I'm going to prioritize the short and snappy ones. From Ignacio Perez: will the Biden administration be more successful than its predecessor in changing the EU's position on Russia, in particular regarding energy security? Perhaps it gives us, we've talked about Nord Stream and not about Russia as a whole. To what scope, really that leads on to the question, to what scope is there for the EU and the US to work together on dealing with Russia? Firstly, Sigrid, then Tony.
I mean, I just sort of, you went so fast. So basically,
Sorry.
the scope, the possibility for the EU and the US to act jointly on Russia. That's basically the question.
Yeah, the question said, with particular regarding energy security, but I think it really implies more generally as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's time for there's a reset now with President Biden and his team and the entire positive outlook towards the European Union. So I would say the first point, the first start is to have a series of meetings where we sort of ideally jointly define areas of shared interest and action. And as Tony said, and you can apply this to all areas of the globe, let's pick 2 or 3 we can at least agree on and can follow through on. And this applies to Russia as well. I'm not I'm not aware of what President von der Leyen is thinking at the moment. But given the fact that Joseph Borrell sort of did not have the best of visits most recently, there'll be some discussions in Brussels. And of course, this is the time with the US to say, okay, how do we view the situation? What will we do? But you can apply the same to Yemen, to Iran, to the nuclear deal. What do we want to get out of it? What needs to be changed in order to tackle Iran's posture in the region, and. I mean, the sky's the limit, sadly, but I think a focused agenda, as Tony said earlier on, focused agenda with concrete steps we will both do, but together will build trust, and I think will encourage both sides to work more together. Doesn't have to be cumbersome, can't be lengthy, because as Tony, I'm referring to Tony again, the US certainly doesn't have time on its side in terms of the electoral cycles, but we also do not have time to waste either, given our own sets of circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Question about the role of the Netherlands, which I think has to be for Sigrid. What from Andrew Jacobson, what kind of role do you see for the Netherlands playing in the EU as the biggest of the small member states, or rather as the reliable ally of the French and the Germans?
Well, it's not either or, neither nor. We often punch above our weight, which is a good thing, I think, because we've got the ideas, we've got the experience, and we're a credible partner to many countries. And still, at least at government level, we are firmly committed to the European ideas and ideals. What can we do? I personally believe, or as D66 leader, we need to rally much more with the French and the Germans. They are the biggest players in Europe. They set the tone, they set the agenda. I do not believe in being a leader of a smaller team, the sort of B league, no pun intended here, but to sort of be with smaller have different alliances within. I think it's very important that we're credible and the go-to partner for the French and the Germans, and ideally be part of the conversation on the same equation, same page, same moment. That won't always happen, but on select issues, building on Tony's point again, on select issues, we are very credible and we are needed to deliver. So we need to be selective.
Tony, do you have a comment on the role of the Dutch in the EU?
No, except to say that I do agree. Well, the Netherlands has always punched above its weight and does come to the table with terrific ideas. And so I agree. It's not just Berlin. It's not just Paris. The Netherlands will be a critical player.
I have one very short, snappy question from Price Rowe, which is: should the EU and the US join forces and boycott the 2022 Olympics in China?
Oh. I haven't thought that far, to be honest. Would be a reason why. I mean, I have to think back on when is the last time an Olympic Games were boycotted, and for which reason?
Well, the Moscow Olympics were boycotted after Afghanistan was invaded. My memory tells me.
I have to think back. So I'm putting a pause button on that one. That's a big decision to make. You've got to be very clear about intent and impact.
Okay, Tony?
Same, I pass on that.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm glad Tony in his retirement does the same.
I think I'm going to pass on that one too. The CER passes on that one as well. Maybe time for one more question. It's another short, snappy one, but it could be a very big question in a way. How does the Biden administration consider the carbon border tax? Will they join together with, I think it means with the EU, or fight in the World Trade Organization? So I think that, let me modify the question. Will the EU and should the EU, will the US and should the EU proceed with a border carbon tax? Can they work together? Will it be done? Will it be made WTO compatible? Firstly, Tony, then Sigrid.
This is a super technical issue, and I'm no expert. I think the effort will be made. The question is, though, okay, once the effort is made, how do you make it WTO compliant? Where do you start? Do you start with the dirtiest imports, whether it's steel and imports like cement, for example, or is it broader? How do you calculate the carbon that is inputs to making a particular import? These are really thorny issues, and all I would say is that we need to put our best brains together on the US and the EU to determine whether can it be done in a WTO compliant manner, and B, how do we roll it out to make sure that they are either the same or at least minimally divergent in terms of what we propose.
Sigrid.
Yeah, I think it's an important measure, but I completely concur with Tony that it's highly technical, highly complex. So it's a good thing to do in theory. The reality of delivery and implementing requires significantly further thought, and definitely it has to be WTO compliant. We cannot propose all kinds of measures and great ideas that are not WTO compliant, because then we risk eroding and undermining the very system we want to harness and strengthen. So it's an important step in the right direction, but it requires significantly greater work. And of course, we also look at this from a level playing field perspective. That's the other sort of the golden goose of the European Union. Level playing field is all important. So we need to be mindful of the unintended and intended consequences.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're going to finish on time. Thank you very much to both our panelists for answering so many questions. Thanks to all our contributors for putting a lot of good questions from the floor by the various methods they used. Thanks to the German Marshall Fund and to Kreab for joining the CER on this very worthwhile event. And I think it leaves me a little bit more optimistic than I was at the beginning. So I'll say cheerio now, and thank you very much to everybody for taking part. Thank you above all to Tony Gardner and Sigrid Kaag. Thank you very much.
Thank you.